Imagine this. You blink, and the shadow of your lamp just moved. Not a draft, not a trick of light, but an undeniable shift. If you've ever felt that chilling prickle of dread from an unseen presence, this video is for you. We're exploring the chilling stories of shadows that dance when no one's watching. Emma Parker never thought of herself as superstitious. New city, new job, new apartment, everything in her life felt like a fresh start. She had signed the lease for Unit 3B with excitement, ignoring the peeling paint in the stairwell and the faint smell of mildew in the hallway. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Her first night was quiet. Too quiet. Emma had lived in noisy cities all her life, sirens, traffic, shouting neighbors. But here, tucked into the aging brick complex on the edge of town, silence pressed in on her like a heavy blanket. Even the hum of the refrigerator sounded loud. She unpacked a few boxes, set up her lamp on the nightstand, and crawled into bed with her phone. The soft yellow light of the lamp spread across the walls, stretching her shadow long across the far corner of the room. She scrolled for a while, eyelids heavy. The room was warm, familiar already, safe. But when she set her phone down and blinked, something was off. Her shadow had shifted. It wasn't where it should have been. The lamp hadn't moved. She hadn't moved. Yet her shadow was leaning closer to the door, as if it had taken a step forward. Emma frowned, sitting up. Her body cast the same shape as always when she moved. She waved an arm. The shadow followed, normal. Just tired, she muttered, switching off the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. She didn't sleep easily. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds. Emma stretched, shaking off the unease of the night. She laughed at herself in the mirror, freaking out over shadows. Real mature. But later, when she came home from work, the feeling returned. She dropped her keys in the bowl, set her bag on the counter, and noticed the faint stretch of her shadow against the wall. The lamp flickered once as she turned it on, buzzing faintly before settling. Her shadow looked normal at first. Then, just for an instant, it seemed to twitch. Like the arm moved a split second before she did. Emma froze. She tested it again. She lifted her hand. The shadow lifted its hand, perfectly in sync. She exhaled, shaking her head. Get a grip, Emma. You're just tired. But the unease lingered. That night, while brushing her teeth, she caught it again in the mirror. Her reflection stood where it should, but the shadow cast by the bathroom light lagged. For a fraction of a second, the shadow of her arm didn't rise until after her real arm had already moved. Emma dropped the toothbrush, heart hammering. She turned sharply, but everything was normal again. The apartment was silent. Too silent. She forced herself back to bed, curling up under the covers. The lamp glowed warmly beside her. She stared at the shadow on the wall, daring it to move. It didn't. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her into uneasy sleep. At 3:17 a.m., she woke with a start. No sound, no reason, just the feeling of being watched. The lamp light was still on. Her shadow stretched across the floor toward the door. But something was wrong. Her body was still, yet the shadow was leaning forward, hand outstretched, as though reaching for the doorknob. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She blinked hard. The shadow snapped back into place. Her hands were trembling as she reached for her phone. The clock glowed red, 3:18. She kept the light on the rest of the night. By the third evening, Emma couldn't ignore it anymore. She sat in her living room with a lamp on, notebook in hand, determined to track what was happening. Each time she thought she saw the shadow twitch, she jotted it down. 8:41 p.m. Shadow leaned left while I was still. 9:03 p.m. Arm twitched independently. 9:47 p.m. Shadow closer to wall than it should be. Her heart pounded as the entries piled up. At 10:22, she froze mid-sentence. The shadow was smiling. Her hand flew to her face. She wasn't smiling. Her mouth was tight, jaw clenched. but the dark shape on the wall stretched into a wide, twisted grin. Emma leapt from the chair, nearly knocking over the lamp. The shadow followed, the grin snapping back to her neutral face as she moved. She backed into the corner, chest heaving. What the hell is happening? Silence. The lamp flickered once, twice, and then went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Emma's scream caught in her throat as she scrambled for her phone. She flicked on the flashlight, shining it wildly. The beam caught the walls, empty corners, familiar furniture. But in the light, her shadow didn't move with her. It stood still, frozen on the wall, smiling. Emma spent the rest of the night sitting in her car outside the building, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. She told herself it was exhaustion, stress, her imagination. But she couldn't shake the truth of what she had seen. Shadows weren't supposed to move when no one was looking, and hers had just smiled at her. Emma didn't sleep in her apartment that night. She sat in her car until sunrise, engine off, wrapped in her coat against the early morning chill. The rising sun finally gave her courage. Daylight always made the fear feel silly, like a child's nightmare fading under the warmth of morning. By noon, she was back inside, convincing herself that exhaustion had been the real culprit. Stress, lack of sleep, imagination, that's all. She made coffee, opened her laptop, tried to lose herself in work emails. For hours, she ignored the shadows stretching across the floor as the sun shifted. She kept telling herself they were harmless. But as daylight drained and evening crept in, the apartment grew heavy again. Shadows pooled in the corners like dark water. That night, Emma sat rigidly on the couch, every lamp in the apartment turned on. The glow chased away most of the darkness, but she couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. It started small. From the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a movement, just a flicker by the kitchen doorway. She turned her head sharply. Nothing. She laughed under her breath, a shaky sound. "You're jumpy, that's all." She went back to scrolling her phone, but then again movement, a flicker by the far wall. This time she turned slowly, as though she might catch it in the act. Still nothing. Her phone slipped from her hand, landing softly on the couch cushion. Her skin prickled. She could feel that something was shifting when she wasn't looking directly at it. She tested the theory. She stared straight ahead at the blank television screen, keeping her peripheral vision wide, and there, yes. A shadow on the wall stretched and crawled higher, even though nothing in the room had moved. Emma's stomach dropped. She whipped her head toward it. Stillness. She sat frozen, heart pounding. The shadows only moved when she wasn't looking. Over the next 2 days, Emma became obsessed. She bought a cheap tripod and set her phone up to record her living room. She sat in the kitchen while the video ran, forcing herself not to peek. When she checked the recording later, the footage showed nothing unusual. The shadows stayed perfectly still. Her hands shook as she replayed the video again and again. It was like the shadows knew they were being watched. On the third night, she overheard her neighbors in the hallway, an older man and woman talking quietly. Their apartment was across from hers, and she recognized their voices, though she'd never spoken to them directly. "You heard it too, didn't you?" The man whispered. "I told you not to bring it up," the woman hissed back. "Don't encourage it." Emma opened her door a crack. "Excuse me?" Both neighbors froze. The woman's face drained of color. The man stepped forward, shaking his head quickly. "Forget it. You don't want to know." "No, please," Emma said. "Has something been strange with the shadows?" The woman made a sharp gesture, silencing her husband. "Don't stare too long," she said in a low voice. "They notice when you notice." Before Emma could reply, the couple hurried down the hall, leaving her standing in the doorway with a chill spreading through her chest. That night, she couldn't bring herself to turn off the lights. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, shadows stretching across the walls. Her mind replayed the neighbor's words on a loop. "They notice when you notice." She turned onto her side, eyes heavy. Maybe sleep would clear her head. But just as she began drifting, the faintest sound pulled her back, a soft creak. Like weight shifting on the floorboards, Emma's eyes snapped open. She lay perfectly still, ears straining. Another creak, closer this time. Her gaze flicked to the wall. Her shadow stretched across it in the dim light of the lamp. But it wasn't alone. Next to it, darker than the rest, was a second shape. Taller, broader. Emma sat up fast, eyes locked on the shadow. The room itself was empty. No figure stood beside her bed. But on the wall, the second shadow loomed. She scrambled for her phone with shaking hands, aiming the flashlight toward the spot. The moment the beam hit the wall, the second shadow vanished. Her own shadow remained, still and ordinary. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps. She lowered the phone slowly but froze again, because her shadow was wrong. Its arm was bent at the elbow, lifted as though reaching for her. Emma's actual arm lay stiffly at her side. Her phone clattered to the floor as she bolted upright, fumbling to switch on every light in the apartment. When she turned back, her shadow was in sync with her again, perfectly ordinary, but the image was seared into her brain. For those few seconds, her shadow had been moving on its own. Emma didn't sleep at all. She sat rigid on the couch, watching the shadows twitch in her peripheral vision, terrified of blinking. At 4:12 a.m., she gave in. Exhaustion crushed her. She let her head fall back against the cushions, eyes fluttering shut, and in that liminal space between waking and dreaming, she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder. Her eyes flew open. No one was there, but across the room, on the wall, her shadow was turned toward her, head tilted, as if studying her. And then, very slowly, it raised its hand and waved. Emma hadn't slept properly in 4 days. Her eyes burned, bloodshot from endless hours of sitting awake, every lamp blazing in her apartment. She lived in a haze of caffeine and adrenaline, but the exhaustion only made things worse. Shadows seemed to crawl faster when she blinked. She told herself she could leave, that nothing tied her to this place. But every time she reached for her packed bag, something stopped her. Some stubborn, irrational thought that if she ran, the shadows might follow. She needed answers. On Wednesday night, she sat cross-legged on her bed with a notebook balanced on her knees. She tried to make sense of it, drawings of the shadows' positions, notes about when they moved, which corners they seemed to favor. Her handwriting was frantic, scrawled in jagged lines. They only move when I'm not looking. Recording doesn't work, they know. One waved. It waved at me. The words looked insane on the page, even to her. Her pen stilled. The silence pressed in. And then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost thought she imagined it. A whisper. At first, she thought it was coming from the hallway. She held her breath, straining her ears. Nothing. She let out a shaky laugh. Sleep deprivation, she muttered, forcing herself to keep writing. But then it came again, this time closer. A hiss of syllables she couldn't quite catch, like breath against the wall. Her head whipped toward the corner of the room. The shadow there shifted just slightly, like a ripple across black water. "Hello?" Emma whispered before she could stop herself. Silence. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She shook her head. Nope, I am not doing this. She turned back to her notebook. And that was when she heard her name, clear, soft, drawn out in a rasp that made her skin crawl. Emma. Her pen dropped from her hand. The whisper had come from the far corner of the room, from the shadow that clung there, darker than the others. Emma grabbed her phone with trembling hands, flicking on the flashlight. The beam swept across the corner, empty, but the shadow didn't vanish. It stayed, thick and unmoving, even under the harsh white light. Emma staggered back, her throat tight. No. The shadow pulsed once, like it was breathing. And then the whisper came again louder. "Emma." She bolted from the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Her chest heaved as she pressed her back to the living room wall. Every light was on, yet the apartment seemed darker than ever. The whispering didn't stop. It seeped under the door, curling into the air like smoke. Dozens of voices now, hushed and overlapping, too many to separate. Her name repeated again and again in a chorus of rasping tones. Emma clapped her hands over her ears. "Stop, just stop." But the whispers grew louder, bleeding into every corner of the apartment. She stumbled backward until her heel caught the edge of the rug. She went down hard, pain shooting up her spine. The ceiling lights flickered violently, and that was when she saw it. On the far wall of the living room, her shadow was no longer attached to her. It stood several feet away, rising taller, its head bent at an unnatural angle. Emma scrambled back on her hands and knees, heart hammering. No, this isn't real. The whispers hushed suddenly, all at once. The silence was worse. Her shadow tilted its head further, as though listening. And then it raised its hand. Her breath caught. She looked down at her own arms, stiff at her sides. But the shadow's arm was reaching forward, fingers stretched as though beckoning. Emma's body shook uncontrollably. She snatched the lamp from the table and hurled it against the wall. Glass shattered. Light sputtered out. Darkness swallowed the room. And in that instant, the whispers exploded, dozens of voices shrieking in overlapping tones, her name distorted beyond recognition. Emma screamed, fumbling for her phone, stabbing at the flashlight button. The beam flicked on. The shadows were gone. The silence returned. Her shadow stood at her feet, perfectly normal again. Emma didn't move for hours. She sat curled on the couch, phone clutched tight in her hands, staring at her own shadow on the opposite wall. It didn't move, didn't twitch, didn't smile. But just before dawn, when her exhaustion finally overcame her, her eyelids slipping shut, she heard one final whisper right against her ear, so close it felt like a breath on her skin. "You're almost ready." Emma Parker was falling apart. She hadn't been to work in nearly a week. Her voicemail was full. Her kitchen sink overflowed with unwashed cups and coffee-stained mugs. She lived in a state of constant vigilance, every light in the apartment blazing, her eyes darting to the walls every few seconds. But it wasn't enough. The whispers hadn't stopped. They came in waves, sometimes soft as a sigh, sometimes hissing in overlapping layers, as though dozens of mouths pressed against her ear at once, always saying her name. Always waiting. Her shadow seemed thinner now, fainter, as though pieces of it were flaking away. Emma knew she couldn't survive like this. She needed answers. The town's public library was ancient, tucked between a boarded-up diner and a thrift shop that smelled of mothballs. The inside was dim and dusty, the kind of place where time seemed to pool in the corners. Emma forced herself down the aisles, her hands trembling as she pulled books on folklore and urban legends. She sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through brittle pages. It didn't take long before she found it. A section on peripheral entities. The ink was faded, but the words were clear enough. They are called the Watchers. Beings that exist only where the eye cannot linger. They move in the edges of sight, shaping themselves from absence. If you turn to look, they are gone. But they are always there, waiting for your gaze to falter. Emma's heart pounded as she read on. When a person notices them too often, the Watchers take interest. First, they mimic. Then they whisper. In time, they separate the soul from its shade. The shadow fades from the living body and is claimed by them. When the shadow is gone, the person soon follows. Her hands trembled so badly, the book slipped from her lap. Separate the soul from its shade, she whispered. Was that what was happening? She glanced down. Even in the dim library light, her shadow looked wrong. Thinner, as if pieces of it were dissolving into the floor. Emma clamped the book shut, shoving it back onto the shelf. She didn't want to read anymore, but as she turned to leave, an old voice stopped her. "You've seen them, haven't you?" Emma spun. An elderly woman sat at the end of the aisle in a faded blue cardigan, her eyes sharp despite the lines etched into her face. "What?" Emma whispered. The woman's mouth pulled into a grim smile. "The shadows. The ones that move when you're not looking." Emma froze. You know about them?" The woman nodded slowly. "We all see them if we're unlucky, but most people dismiss them as tricks of the eye. That's what keeps them safe." Emma swallowed hard. "And if you don't dismiss them?" The woman's smile faded. "Then you've already given them too much attention. The more you notice, the more they notice you. That's how they feed." Emma's breath caught. "Feed?" "On your shadow," the woman said simply. "On the tether between who you are and the darkness you cast. Once they sever it, you're theirs." Emma's legs felt weak. She leaned against the shelf for support. How do I stop them?" The woman looked away, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't. Once the Watchers find you, there's no stopping them. The best you can do is delay. And pray they grow bored before they finish their work." Emma shook her head violently. "No, there has to be something." The woman stood slowly, gathering her purse. "Then don't look, child. Pretend they aren't there. That's the only weapon you have left." She shuffled away, leaving Emma trembling in the aisle. That night, Emma tried to follow the advice. She kept her gaze fixed on her phone, refusing to glance at the edges of the room. She turned her head sharply whenever she caught the flicker of movement, but the shadows weren't fooled. They moved anyway. She could feel them shifting, pressing closer, even as she refused to look. By midnight, she couldn't take it anymore. She hurled her phone across the room and screamed into the silence. "I know you're there. Stop hiding." The apartment went utterly still. Her shadow stretched across the wall in the lamplight. And then, right before her eyes, it peeled away from her body. Emma staggered back, heart slamming against her ribs. No, 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 no. The shadow rose taller, its edges trembling like smoke. It wasn't just a dark shape anymore, it was a figure, separate and alive. For the first time, it turned its head toward her, and Emma felt the weight of its gaze. Her knees buckled. She stumbled backward until she hit the wall. The figure tilted its head slowly, like a predator studying prey, and then it smiled. Emma's scream tore through the apartment as every lamp flickered violently, shadows crawling across the walls in a frenzy. Her vision blurred, her body shook. She felt something pulling at her, tugging deep inside, as though invisible strings were hooked into her chest. She clutched at her heart, gasping for air. When the lights finally steadied, her shadow was back at her feet. But it was thinner now, hollow, and she knew the Watchers had begun to claim it. Emma hadn't left her apartment in days. Food delivery bags piled near the door. Curtains stayed drawn, as though keeping the daylight out would somehow keep the shadows from growing stronger. But nothing worked. Her shadow was no longer hers. When she stood still, it twitched. When she waved her hand, it delayed, lagging like a broken video feed. Sometimes it didn't follow at all. By Friday night, Emma couldn't deny it anymore. Her shadow wasn't attached to her. It was watching her. She sat in front of the bathroom mirror, the only room where she could trap herself under direct, unforgiving light. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, casting harsh white beams that left little room for dark corners. Emma studied her reflection. She lifted her arm. Her reflection lifted its arm, but the shadow on the wall behind her didn't. Instead, it stayed frozen, arm at its side, head tilted slightly, just enough to make it wrong. Emma gripped the edge of the sink, her breath coming in sharp bursts. "You're not me," she whispered. The shadow's head tilted further, as if in acknowledgement. Her knees weakened. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over the bath mat. The fluorescent light flickered once, twice, and then in the mirror Emma saw her shadow smiled. Her own reflection didn't move at all. She fled the bathroom, slamming the door shut. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Her neighbor's warning echoed in her mind. They notice when you notice. Well, they had noticed. And now she realized she was running out of time. That night, she dreamt of a world without light. She stood in an endless black plain, shadows rippling across the ground like liquid. They weren't tied to people. They crawled freely, slithering like serpents, faces forming and dissolving in the shifting dark. She felt her own shadow peel from her feet, sliding into the mass. She screamed, but no sound came out. The shadows whispered in unison, one word over and over. Replace, replace, replace. She woke drenched in sweat, throat raw, heart hammering, and she knew the dream wasn't just a dream. It was a warning. By Saturday, Emma's shadow had broken free completely. It no longer clung to her feet. It lingered in corners, slid across the floor, and sometimes, God help her, stood directly behind her reflection in the mirror. She tried to call someone, anyone, but her phone only buzzed with static whenever she lifted it to her ear. The shadows didn't want her to tell. By evening, she was delirious with fear. She sat curled on the couch, every lamp blazing, her laptop open in front of her. She typed frantically into search bars, how to stop shadows moving when no one's looking. Shadow entities folklore. Most results were nonsense, conspiracy blogs. Creepypasta, paranormal forums filled with teenagers. But one post froze her blood, a thread titled, "When Your Shadow Moves on Its Own." The top reply read, "If it's separated from you, it's already too late. It won't stop until it replaces you." Emma slammed the laptop shut. Her stomach twisted violently. She felt eyes on her. Slowly, she turned. Her shadow stood at the far end of the living room, taller than it had ever been. Its arms hung at its sides, fingers curling unnaturally long. It tilted its head. Then it stepped forward. Emma stumbled back against the wall, her hands pressed flat to the plaster. "Stay away from me." The shadow kept moving, slow, deliberate. It didn't cross the floor so much as glide, the darkness bending around it. It reached the edge of the lamplight and stopped. Emma's breath caught. It couldn't step fully into the light. Not yet. But then, with horrifying certainty, the lamps flickered. One by one, the bulbs overhead sputtered out. Darkness rushed in. Emma's scream split the air as the shadow lunged. When the lights steadied again, Emma was on the floor, trembling violently. The shadow stood inches away, looming over her. She forced herself to look down and gasped. Her shadow was no longer under her feet at all. It was beside her, independent, separate. Her tether was broken. By Sunday morning, Emma knew what was coming. She sat numbly at the kitchen table, watching her shadow pace across the walls. It moved with a freedom that made her sick. Sometimes it paused to mimic her posture. Other times it simply stared at her, head tilted as though studying. When she finally gathered the courage to look in the mirror, she saw the truth. Her reflection stood pale and hollow-eyed, but her shadow, standing behind her reflection, was smiling. That night, Emma jolted awake in her bed. Someone was breathing beside her. Her heart froze. She turned slowly, dread crawling up her spine. The bed was empty, but on the mattress, where her body should have left only rumpled sheets, lay her shadow. It was curled on its side, perfectly mimicking the position she'd been in minutes before. And when Emma sat upright, the shadow didn't move. It stayed, occupying her place, replacing her. Emma had stopped fighting. It wasn't because she had accepted her fate. It was because every attempt to resist had only fed the thing more strength. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage. Every wall bore her shadow, every corner whispered with movement she couldn't catch. The air was heavy, like breathing smoke, and her shadow, it was no longer content with standing behind her. It wanted to be her. She clung to the one thing she hadn't yet abandoned, light. Every lamp blazed. The oven light, the bathroom light, even the flashlight apps on her phones, all left running until batteries drained to nothing. But the shadows didn't care anymore. They had learned how to bend the light. Emma stared as her own lamps cast shapes that shouldn't exist. Instead of banishing darkness, the glow seemed to sculpt it, twisting it into figures that slithered across her walls. Her shadow stood at the center, smiling wider than ever. Sunday night, 3:12 a.m., the moment it all ended. Emma sat in her living room, every lamp pointed toward her, her laptop open to a blank document. She typed with shaking fingers. If anyone finds this, know that shadows are not what you think they are. They are waiting, watching. They move when you don't look because that is the only time they're free. And if your shadow ever stops following you, run. Don't look back. Don't. She stopped. The letters on the screen were changing. Not from her keystrokes, from it. The text erased itself, replaced by a single sentence. She's almost ready. Emma shoved the laptop shut, her heart slamming against her ribs. She turned toward the wall and froze. Her shadow was gone. A slow, deliberate breath whispered in her ear. She spun around. There it was, standing in front of her. No longer flat, no longer confined. It was three-dimensional now, a perfect silhouette filled with writhing liquid black. It reached a hand toward her face. Emma screamed, and the lights all went out. Silence, darkness. When the bulbs flickered back to life a few seconds later, Emma was still there, or at least something that looked like her. She stood in the center of the room, motionless. Her eyes were empty, pupils swallowed by darkness. And when she smiled, the expression didn't belong to her. The shadows on the wall behind her rippled, dozens of them whispering, echoing the same word, replace. 2 days later, the landlord entered after neighbors reported screams. He found the apartment abandoned, but on the living room wall, under the glow of a single lamp, he saw it, a shadow. A woman's shadow, smiling, even though no one stood there to cast it.